Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Sibley Lecture. I'm Emrys Westacott, Professor of Philosophy here at Alfred University, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. To prevent Zoom bombing and interference by foreign governments, you'll be muted during the talk, but you can raise questions using the chat. At the end, you'll be able to unmute yourself if you wish to speak, or I can simply read out your questions. And I would ask that if you plan to multitask like a certain well-known New Yorker journalist, that you keep your video turned off. First then, a word about the Sibley Lecture. This is an annual lecture in philosophy or religious studies hosted by the Division of Human Studies that honors the late Professor Myron or Mike Sibley. Mike Sibley was a much-loved teacher and colleague who taught religious studies at AU for 26 years before he retired in 1979. And this year, as well as honoring Mike Sibley, we would like to pay tribute to another philosopher and teacher who dedicated many years of service to our university and to the wider community, Bill Dibrell, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Bill taught at Alfred for almost 37 years. He was an outstanding teacher with an unusually broad range of interests. He had real expertise on difficult technical issues in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, but he also had a comprehensive command of the history of philosophy and offered many important classes on topics in moral and political theory, such as justice, equality, and freedom. And his intellectual curiosity was unflagging. In the last 3 years, he became very interested in Chinese philosophy, taught a class on it, and incorporated it into another completely new course he developed on human nature and the cosmos. Bill helped countless students to deepen their understanding of the world they were setting out to explore. We miss him already, and when things return to normal, we'll miss not just the courses he could teach, but his conversation in the lounge, his good humor, his wisdom, and I would add his unfailing kindness to everyone he met. Kindness, as we have surely learned in recent times, is not a virtue we should take for granted or undervalue. So we are dedicating this year's Sibley Lecture to the memory of Bill, and this is appropriate, not only because he deserves the honor, but also because this evening's lecture is in fact part of his legacy. For it was Bill who first contacted Professor Irvin about giving a Sibley Lecture. Professor Irvin, who also goes by Bill, had more in common with our Bill than just a name. In fact, their professional lives exhibit an odd sort of mirroring. Bill Dibrell was an undergraduate in California, completed his PhD in Michigan, and came to teach at Alfred in 1983. Bill Irvin was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, completed his graduate studies in California at UCLA, and arrived at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where he's currently Professor of Philosophy, in 1983. Professor Irvin is the author of several books, including A Slap in the Face, which is about how to deal with insults, On Desire, which is about how to control one's desires, and A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, all published by Oxford University Press. Professor Irvin works in an ancient but rather unfashionable philosophical tradition, one that seeks to apply philosophical reflection to life itself, to how we live. In doing this, he writes with admirable clarity, consciously addressing not a narrow band of scholars, but a broad readership. In his own words, his intended audience, I quote, can best be described as intellectually upscale general readers who have a minimal background in philosophy, but who are interested in carefully rethinking the assumptions of everyday life. And I assured him that tonight his audience would be intellectually upscale. Anyway, as I said, Bill Dibrell it was who first invited Professor Irvin to give a Sibley Lecture. It was originally scheduled for April, but then we encountered a minor setback in the form of a worldwide pandemic. Life will sometimes throw us these curveballs. Happily, we have Zoom, and happily, Professor Irvin has a talk to give us about dealing with life's setbacks. So with that, I will hand over to Professor William Irvin.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. And I want to start out by thanking Alfred University for this invitation. I wish I could have visited you in person. I had airline reservations and everything set up, but that was just not in the cards. And I'm honored to be chosen to deliver the Sibley Lecture. And I am dedicating tonight's lecture to Professor William Debrell. I received a few emails from him in the early planning, and then after that, his health apparently took a turn for the worse, which is unfortunate. So this evening, I'm going to be telling you about Stoicism. And Stoicism is one of many ancient schools of philosophy. But when I talk about schools of philosophy, you're likely to get the wrong idea. You yourself might have attended what these days counts as a school of philosophy. You might, that is, have taken a philosophy class at a university. But your experience was nothing like that of a student in one of the ancient schools. In ancient Greece and Rome, the schools of philosophy were run as businesses. Students paid fees to their teacher, and it was by means of these fees that he, and it would typically would have been a man, that he made his living. As businesses, schools of philosophy were exposed to market forces. This meant that they had to fight for market share. There were any number of schools that a student could attend, so the heads of the schools were compelled to offer a service that students were willing to pay for, or in some cases that the parents of the students were willing to pay for. Otherwise, the school would go out of business. And of course, if it folded, the philosophy that they taught would, in some sense, go extinct. And that's presumably the reason that we today discuss Stoicism. It was one of the most successful ancient schools, but we don't discuss, say, the philosophy taught by the Anicerean school. That school flopped. For a modern analog of the ancient schools of philosophy, we might consider schools of martial arts. An internet search reveals the existence of lots of competing schools, all of them run as businesses. Some schools teach widely known forms of martial arts, such as judo and karate. Other schools teach a version of martial arts that the founder invented. These different schools are all trying to get market share. And if a school can't attract students, it fails. So it's very much, I mean, that's a nice model for the ancient schools of philosophy. Contrast that with the way philosophy is taught in modern universities. As a philosophy professor, I don't have to fight for market share. I don't have to fret about whether my classes will draw sufficient students. I don't even have to offer a product that students are willing to pay for. To the contrary, my classes tend to be filled with students who, if I ask them why they signed up for my class, will likely answer that they had to so they could graduate, so they could fulfill their dream of becoming, say, an investment banker, I don't know, or a lawyer or something else. It's unlikely that these students chose my university on the basis of the quality of its philosophy department, or indeed on the basis of whether it even had a philosophy department. It's hard for a modern philosophy professor like myself to imagine what it must have been like to run a school of philosophy in the ancient world. Imagine the feeling that if you didn't offer a philosophy that students were willing to pay for, you might, within a short period of time, find yourself making your living not as a teacher, but as, say, a stonemason. I would have made a terrible stonemason. And at my age, for sure, that would have been the case. This presumably would have had a profound impact on what you taught in your classes and how you taught it. Because they had to attract students, the heads of the ancient schools of philosophy had to offer something that students, or more precisely their parents, were willing to pay for. And this typically meant providing the students with two things. So first, the teachers in these schools taught skills that would be useful to students in their subsequent career. And high on the list of desirable skills would have been speaking and argumentative skills that the students could use if they subsequently practiced law or went into politics, which was the course that many of them took. But the second thing schools offered was advice on how students could best conduct their everyday life. In its grandest form, this advice would constitute what I call a philosophy of life. And such a philosophy has two components. First, it tells you what things in life are most worth having. And second, it provides you with a strategy for attaining whatever it is that's worth having. So those things are common among different philosophies of life, but they differ over what is worth having and differ over how best to get it. The contrast with modern philosophy is striking. Philosophy departments still try to develop students' argumentative skills, but in very many cases, they no longer attempt to provide students with a philosophy of life. It's true that we teach our students ethics, both theoretical and applied, in part so they can become people who are good in the moral sense of the word. But this is quite different from instructing them on what they ought to do in daily living if they wish to have a good life. Indeed, I would argue that it's not only possible, but surprisingly easy for a person who is good in the moral sense of the word to end up having a bad life, either because he chooses the wrong goals in daily living or chooses the right goals but pursues them in a foolish manner and therefore never attains those goals. Because we don't provide our students with a philosophy of life, most of them leave our classes wanting pretty much what they wanted before being exposed to philosophy, namely a job that will let them acquire, I don't know, if they're materialistic, let them acquire a cool car, wear fashionable clothes, and live in a big house located in a desirable neighborhood and filled with high-end appliances and the very latest electronic gadgets. In a materialistic world, this is what people dream of. And it isn't just college students whose life is unaffected by their exposure to philosophy. The same can be said for most of their professors. We profs encountered off campus are pretty much indistinguishable from, say, accountants in kind of the material aspect of our existence. Now, it's true that accountants have cooler cars than we do and live in bigger houses, but this, I would maintain, is not because of any difference in our value. It's just that accountants have more disposable income than we philosophers do. Dramatically raise our income, and let me assure you that in short order, many of us would be breaking ground for the construction of a McMansion. In the ancient world, this wouldn't have been the case. The philosophers who ran the schools of philosophy would have personally adopted the philosophy of life that they taught their students. And this adoption would have affected how they dressed and ate, where they lived, how they related to other people, and countless other details of their daily existence. Students who attended schools of philosophy would also, if they took their schooling seriously, have been personally transformed by their education. They wouldn't just think differently than they formerly did. They would live differently as well. Consequently, in the ancient world, if you met the head of a school of philosophy or a graduate of his school, you would have quickly sensed that this person was marching to the beat of a different drummer. He would value things that most people don't value, and he would be utterly indifferent to some of the things that most people crave. Let me now turn my attention to the philosophy of life that has won my heart and mind, namely the philosophy espoused by ancient Stoics. Before I describe the Stoic philosophy of life, though, let me take a moment to put Stoics into their historical and philosophical context. Stoicism was invented by Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium in about 300 BC. He borrowed elements from the Cynic school, the Megarian school, and the Academy, that's the school founded by Plato, to form his new philosophy. This, I might add, resembles the way someone who wanted to start a new school of martial arts might invent a new fighting style by combining the techniques taught by rival schools. So that's another interesting parallel. Later on, the Romans imported Stoicism and put their own spin on it. In the Stoic books I have written, and in my remarks this evening, I'm interested primarily in Roman Stoicism, since it is, I think, the form of Stoicism that we know best. This is partly because the writings of the Greek Stoics have for the most part been lost. And it's also the form of Stoicism that I think has the most to offer to 21st century individuals. I suspect that all of you have heard of, or maybe even read the Stoics, but perhaps without knowing that they were Stoics. You've probably heard of Marcus Aurelius, who, besides being a Stoic, was one of the greatest Roman emperors. Seneca and Epictetus were also Roman Stoics. The works of these three Stoics, I might add, routinely dominate Amazon's ancient philosophy bestsellers list. So it's interesting, but in this century, among the books that ordinary people buy, the Stoic books, among the philosophy books ordinary people buy, Stoic books are near the top. Like any philosophy of life, Stoicism has two components. First, it tells us what things in life are most worth attaining, and second, it tells us how best to attain those things. This means that Stoicism is not a religion. The primary concern of most religions, after all, is to help us have a good afterlife. That's kind of the ultimate goal. More precisely, religions tend to be relatively unconcerned with how we spend our days, as long as we don't spend them doing things that will jeopardize our afterlife. The primary concern of philosophies of life, by way of contrast, is with helping us have a good life. What should a person do then who wishes to have both a good life and a good afterlife? My advice would be to supplement the religious belief that you think will get you into heaven, if you have one, with the philosophy of life that will enable you to flourish during your time on earth. And along these lines, let me point out that Stoicism seems particularly compatible with Christianity. This is in part because the early Christians were influenced by the Stoics. Indeed, when modern Christians read the Stoics, they're likely to experience a form of déjà vu. Epictetus, for example, counsels us to distinguish between the things we can control and the things we can't control, and to focus our energies on the things we can control. Christians reading this advice might be reminded of the so-called Serenity Prayer, often attributed to 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And it goes like this: God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Niebuhr, one suspects, knew his Stoics. Along similar lines, Christians will appreciate Marcus Aurelius's injunction that we love mankind. Suppose, though, that someone doubts whether there is a hereafter. This person would also do well to acquire a philosophy of life. After all, for the person in question, it's the here and now. The here and now is all he's got. It's sensible, therefore, that he do what he can to increase his chances of spending it as happily as he can. And I would argue that by adopting the time-tested philosophy of life, he can prevent himself from wasting the one earthly life that he has to live. Wasting it by spending his days pursuing worthless baubles, or pursuing in a foolish manner things that are in fact worth attaining, and because he's pursuing them in a foolish manner, fails to attain them. And what, according to the Stoic philosophy of life, is most worth attaining? Tranquility. In a word, it would be tranquility. Our goal in life, they say, should be to attain and then maintain our tranquility. But having said this, several clarifications are in order. To begin with, it's important to realize that the kind of tranquility Stoics had in mind was not the kind of tranquility that you can get from ingesting a Xanax or enjoying a third martini, nor was it a kind of emotional numbness. For the Stoics, tranquility meant the absence, to the extent possible, of negative emotions, such as grief, anger, fear, anxiety, and envy. They had nothing at all, though, against positive emotions, including that most positive of emotions, joy. Therefore, the phrase joyful Stoic is not an oxymoron. If you take anything away from tonight's lecture, I want you to take this. The uppercase S Stoics of whom I'm speaking were not lowercase s stoical, the way the word is defined in the dictionary. They were not, in other words, glum and stiff individuals. They were not emotional icebergs who stood mutely and took whatever life could throw at them. To the contrary, they appear to have been a rather cheerful bunch of individuals. That's really strange, but that seems to be the truth. Those who knew them seem to have loved them, and the Stoics seem to have requited this love. So it's a view quite at odds with a common conception of what Stoicism requires. Although Stoicism was quite popular in ancient Greece and Rome and remained popular in the 19th century, up to the 19th century, by the 20th century, it was widely ignored. So I entered college in 1970 and became a philosophy major. I did encounter the Stoics, but I did it in a logic class rather than an ordinary philosophy class. And this is because the Stoics were responsible for, besides the philosophy of life, they also are responsible for the logical inference rule known as modus ponens. And that's where I encountered them. I thought, well, that's pretty good. I had no idea they were also pushing a kind of philosophy of life. And in the philosophy classes I took, the professors seemed to have little interest in developing a philosophy of life. In fact, they seemed to think that developing such a philosophy was simply not the proper job of a philosopher. To succeed in our philosophical careers, they made it clear, we needed to focus our attention on academic debates that had been going on for centuries, if not millennia, and that if they could ever be settled, would have little impact on our lives. Fortunately, all this has changed. At many universities, including there at Alfred, philosophy students have the opportunity to explore philosophies of life, including Stoicism. In the mid-2000s, I was doing research on human desire. I asked myself the question, why do we want the things that we want? In the process of doing this research, I came across Stoicism again and their philosophy of life. I gave it a try and found that it did a wonderful job of preventing me from experiencing negative emotions. I was hooked. And as soon as I had finished writing my book on human desire, I set to work on the book that became my guide to the good life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, which I've been told some of you have read. I felt that as a newly converted Stoic, I had a duty to share this life-altering philosophy with the world at large. I wrote the guide fully aware that it would be difficult to find a publisher. There didn't, after all, seem to be much of a market for books on Stoicism. And to illustrate this point, let me share a few numbers with you. Go to Amazon and do an advanced search for books written in English with the words Stoic or Stoicism in their title that existed in January of 2008. That's back when I was trying to find a publisher for my book on Stoicism. I recently did such a search and about 200 titles popped up. So that's 200 books on with Stoic or Stoicism in the title. Many of these books were written by the ancient Stoics themselves, right? And sometimes many different translation of the same Stoic. Others were written by scholars primarily for other scholars, and only a few attempted to introduce Stoicism to general audiences. Now, in order to get a book published, you need to interest a publisher. And in order to do that, you need to submit a proposal in which you not only describe the book that you're writing, but provide evidence that you're capable of writing that book. And most important, provide evidence that a market exists for the kind of book you're writing. And as the numbers I've just provided indicate, it was questionable whether there was indeed a market for a book on Stoicism. If there had been, wouldn't lots of people be writing those books? I therefore proceeded on the assumption that my book was unlikely to find a publisher, and that if it did find one, maybe a dozen copies would sell, half of which would be purchased by my friends who might or might not read them. You never know. But in the end, I did find a publisher, and in hindsight, my timing was impeccable. I got in at what appears to have been the ground floor of the 21st century Stoic Renaissance. Rest assured that this timing was not the result of brilliance or foresight on my part. I can best, I'm perfectly willing to attribute it to dumb luck. To appreciate the magnitude of this renaissance in interest in Stoicism, here's another Amazon search you can do. Search for books in English with either the word Stoic or Stoicism in the title that were published last month, namely during September. You'll get about 50 hits. Conclusion: in September, books on Stoicism were being published at the rate of more than one book a day. It's just a vastly different literary landscape than existed in 2008. I'd love to be able to explain this renaissance, but I find the whole phenomenon rather puzzling. There's evidence to suggest that the Silicon Valley was the epicenter for this renaissance, but it isn't clear why or how it could have played this role. One easy explanation for the current popularity of Stoicism is its hackability. Now, that's a word I hate, but it's the right word to use. It's a philosophy that's easy to explain and easy to disassemble into actionable strategies for living. The same cannot be said of, say, the philosophy of Hegel. But this explanation clearly doesn't get to the bottom of things, since the hackability that I just described was there throughout the 20th century, during which time Stoicism dropped off the cultural radar. And before moving on, a cultural aside is in order. In my guide, I take a few sentences to describe what I refer to as stealth Stoicism. So this would have been written in the mid-2000s. I explain to my readers that they can test drive Stoicism without anybody else being any the wiser. And what I've noticed in recent years is that I've gotten emails from people who are puzzled that anyone would feel a need to do such a thing. Why keep secrets? And indeed, when you look at the social media, which, by the way, I make a point of not doing, you find that the current consensus thinking seems to be, why keep anything a secret? I try to explain to these individuals that back in the day, namely way back at the turn of the millennium, it would have been kind of weird to go around telling people that you were a Stoic. Indeed, it probably would have been a surefire conversation stopper. But all this has changed. These days, it's actually kind of cool to be a Stoic. And how cool is that? I've been told that I would be addressing tonight my remarks a mixed audience. Some of you have read Guide to the Good Life. Thank you. And I hope that this book did not disappoint you. But there are doubtless others in the audience who don't know a lot about Stoicism. And if you're in this category, let me, by way of initiation to Stoicism, introduce you to some of the basic Stoic psychological strategies. Many people try to attain happiness by getting whatever it is that they find themselves wanting. They think that by doing so, they will finally gain everlasting happiness, that they will live happily ever after, if only they can get that thing that they find themselves wanting. The problem is that before long, in a matter of days, or maybe even in a matter of hours, they'll start taking whatever it is they acquired for granted. And therefore, they will be no closer to happiness than was formerly the case. These individuals are on what psychologists refer to as a hedonic treadmill, always trudging forward, never getting any further along. Many ancient thinkers, including the Buddha, have realized that there's a way to get off this treadmill. Instead of working to get what we want, we can strive to want the things we already have. We can teach ourselves to take delight in what we have rather than taking what we have for granted. Okay, you might say, point taken, but how can you learn to want what you already have? The tricks, the Stoics said, was to develop your ability to accept, appreciate, and even to savor the life that you find yourself living. One way to accomplish this is by employing the psychological technique known as negative visualization. And this is the first Stoic teaching I'm going to first Stoic technique that I'm going to teach you tonight. It's a technique that's simple to learn, easy to use, and surprisingly effective. So let me tell you how you do it. I want you to take a moment to think about your life, about your relationships, and about your circumstances. Pick something that plays an important role in your life. It might be your spouse or partner. It might be your job, your children, your health. Pick something important to you. Now take a few seconds to imagine that thing disappearing from your life. Maybe your spouse just says, I filed for a divorce. Maybe you get an email from your boss saying that you've been laid off. Lots of people have recently. And this one's sort of sad, but maybe you get a phone call from the police informing you that your child has been in an accident. Or imagine that your health takes a sudden turn for the worse. Maybe you break a leg slipping on some leaves, or even worse, you wake up one morning and realize that you've lost the ability to see. Such things do happen. Now that you have your topic, you can do the visualization. Think of the consequences that the disappearance you've picked would have for you and the life you're living. Form a mental image of what it would be like, and mentally fill in some of the details. Let that image sink in for a few seconds. Now return to life as usual. Congratulations, you just practiced Stoicism. Paradoxically, having flickering negative thoughts of the kind I've just described, rather than making you sad or even depressed, can contribute to your happiness. It accomplishes this by changing your perspective on your circumstances. Instead of taking those circumstances, including your spouse, your job, child, or health, instead of taking them for granted, you will realize how lucky you are to have them. Suppose that in your negative visualization, you imagine that your child had been in an accident. When you next encounter this child, you might notice a difference. You might notice that you're behaving differently toward her than you otherwise would have. Instead of merely acknowledging her existence, you might find yourself savoring her presence in your life. You might find yourself wanting to do with her the things that would have been impossible to do if she had ceased to be part of your life. Maybe you suddenly have an urge to read to her, play a game with her, or maybe even sing a silly song with her, things that otherwise just you wouldn't even have considered. As a result of engaging in negative visualization, those activities might be the high point of your day, and they wouldn't have happened had you not engaged in it. Negative visualization is effective even if your situation in life is quite difficult. This is because it's almost always the case that whatever your situation is, it could be worse, even much worse than it is. And keeping that fact in mind can help you not only cope with your circumstances, but keep an upbeat attitude as you do. Suppose you find yourself living in a crude cabin. Stoic advice, don't spend your time there thinking about what it would be like to live in a mansion. Think instead about what it would be like to live in a tent or to be living without any shelter at all. Do this and you will appreciate living in the cabin. Now, the sense of appreciation brought on by negative visualization wears off, unfortunately. Meaning that negative visualization is easy to do periodically in the day. So it's like, you can think of it, it's like a prescription ointment that says apply as needed, and negative visualization is that sort of thing. It's easy to negatively visualize. It can be done almost anywhere, in your kitchen, in your workplace, in a battlefield trench, or even, believe it or not, as you're being wheeled off for surgery. As you're being wheeled, you can take a moment to think about how lucky you are that your condition isn't inoperable. This brings us to the second psychological strategy of the Stoics that I'm going to be teaching you tonight. And I call it the last time meditation. To set the stage for learning this technique, I've got some gloomy news for you. For everything you do, there will be a last time you do it. This is a direct consequence of your mortality. Because you will someday die, there will be a last time that you tie your shoes, a last time that you pay your taxes, a last time that you eat chocolate. There will be a last time that you brush your teeth, lay your head on a pillow, and close your eyes. There will also be a last breath that you take. Sometimes people know that they're doing something for the last time. This is the case with a condemned prisoner eating his last meal. More commonly, though, people do something without realizing that it's the last time that they'll do it. They instead act on the assumption that they will do the thing again in the future, perhaps hundreds of times. Along these lines, consider the last time you played hopscotch, the last time you made a phone call with a rotary phone, and the last time you wrote a document on a typewriter. When you did that, did you realize at the time that that was the last time you're going to do those things? Realize too that it's possible that you've eaten chocolate for the last time. I sincerely hope that this isn't the case, but only time will tell. The knowledge that you're doing something for the last time can have a profound impact on the experience. Consider, for example, the difference between going to a favorite restaurant on the assumption that you can do so again at will in the future, and going to that restaurant on the night it's slated to close. The last time dining experience is likely to be much more meaningful than the previous experiences were, in large part because, like a condemned prisoner, you know you won't be taking your last meal for granted. And some of you might recently, in recent weeks, months, you might have had this feeling of you read that a restaurant, your favorite restaurant, is closing down, and you realize you actually did have your last meal then, except you took it for granted that you could have them forever, as long as you wanted to while you were alive in the future. Another example, consider the difference between giving your lover a kiss as you head off to work and giving your lover a kiss as you embark on a potentially dangerous journey as you head off, for example, for a tour of duty in the Army. That first kiss, that little peck as you're going off to work, is done on the assumption that there'll be another kiss later in the day. Honey, I'm home. And it's therefore no big deal and is forgotten within moments. The soldier giving the second kiss, though, does so, the soldier giving the kiss I described, does so in the knowledge that it might be his last, because he knows that in coming months he could die, meaning that this would be his last kiss, period. And knowing that even if he doesn't die, it's possible that in the months he and his lover are apart, she might fall in love with someone else, meaning that this would be the last kiss he would ever share with her. And that makes it an unusually meaningful event. Like negative visualization, the last time meditation is easy for you to learn and easy for you to do. Periodically during the day, you simply pause to consider the possibility that whatever it is you're doing for the last time. You're eating chocolate or kissing your lover? As you do so, consider the possibility that this will be the last time that you do it. And you'll likely find that as a result, both the chocolate and the kiss will be noticeably sweeter. By thinking in last time terms, you simultaneously invest an experience with special significance, and you focus your attention on it. As a result, you might find yourself living in the moment. What a strange feeling that is. And I'm going to pause here to talk about this experience of living in the moment. Those of you who have done Zen meditation, you sit on the floor and comfortable, and your Zen instructor tells you to clear your mind of all thoughts and focus on your breathing. And if you've ever tried that, you know how difficult it is to do, because your brain is alive with unwanted thoughts. They just drift into your brain and drift out. So some of them are thoughts about the past. You think about something that somebody said to you yesterday. Others are thoughts about the future. You are sitting there, and instead of doing your Zen, you're contemplating what you're going to have for dinner. There's an evolutionary explanation for this temporal drifting. We humans are programmed to think about the past so we can learn from it. We're likewise programmed to think about the future so we can plan for it. By thinking about the past and future, our evolutionary ancestors increased their chances of surviving and reproducing. So I want you to imagine an early human, let's call him Dave, who found it easy to stay in the moment and difficult to think about the past or future. He might, as a result, be perfectly happy sitting on a rock, staring out at the savannas of Africa, thinking, isn't all this wonderful? This satisfaction with his existence is admirable, but on the savannas of Africa, it would have come at a price because it would simultaneously increase Dave's chances of getting eaten and decrease his chance of finding his next meal to eat. Dave would therefore likely perish and before creating any offspring, and he would have taken his easy to please, stay in the moment genes with him. Thing is, we no longer live on the savannas. We live mostly in towns and cities in which we have zero chance of getting even, and in which our primary dietary concern is not whether we will get our next meal, but whether we will again overeat during that meal. Doing the last time meditation allows us to temporarily bypass our evolutionary program. Instead of thinking about things that have happened and things that are likely to happen, we think about what is happening to us right now. And as a result, we live for a time in the moment. And this increases the chance that we will savor whatever it is that we are then experiencing. As a result of doing the last time meditation as part of my Stoic practice, I discovered a new way to have fun by doing what I refer to as last time resets. Allow me to explain. During the pandemic-induced lockdown, my wife and I started taking lots of long walks around our neighborhood. Because the neighborhood kids were also locked down, they started playing outside their houses, and a lot of the play involved chalk and sidewalks. On one walk, my wife and I came across a crudely drawn hopscotch game. I realized that from a Stoic point of view, this represented a golden opportunity. I had last played hopscotch at maybe age 7, and here before me was a chance to reset my last time event with respect to hopscotch. Indeed, I could move it forward by more than 6 decades, from age 7 to age 68. So I set off hopping. By my third hop, I was seriously off balance, and to regain it and possibly avoid a trip to the emergency room, I had to step outside the boxes. Game over. But who cares? I not only had a bit of fun, but demonstrated that although I am not as skillful at the game of hopscotch as I once was, I am still very much a player in the game of life. Okay, let's turn our attention now to Stoic strategies for dealing with life's setbacks. In my most recent book called The Stoics Challenge, which came out about a year ago, I described the psychological technique known as framing. We may not have complete control over what setbacks we experience, but we have considerable control over how we frame those setbacks. And by judicious framing, we can minimize the amount of emotional harm that they do us. Allow me to explain. To use the comedic frame, we treat an unpleasant event as the basis for a joke. Socrates did this when someone came up and unexpectedly boxed his ears. Isn't it a shame, he said, that when you go out for a walk, you can't know ahead of time whether or not to wear a helmet? By framing the event as comedic, he prevented himself from getting upset. To understand what so there's another frame that I call the game frame, and to understand what it involves, imagine that you're running across a grassy field when someone runs up from behind and tackles you, knocking you to the ground. How you react to this event depends on what game you take yourself to be playing at the time. If you were participating in a cross-country race, you're going to be traumatized and might even call the police. Somebody tackled you. But if you're instead participating in a football game, you might respond to getting tackled by jumping up and doing a joyful little dance. You gained 8 yards before they tackled you. Here's the thing, although the physical sensations you experienced in these two cases are quite similar, which game frame you put them in will have a profound impact on how much they hurt, both physically and emotionally. The frame that I explore in greatest detail in my book, The Stoic Challenge, is what I call the Stoic test frame. To use this frame, you imagine that life setbacks are tests administered by the Stoic gods. They test us not to punish us, but to toughen us up. And to pass these tests, we must do two things. First, we must come up with a workaround for the setback that they've administered. And second, and more importantly, we must stay calm and cool while we come up with this workaround. These tests, I should add, are self-graded. I've been experimenting with the Stoic test strategy for years with some curious consequences. One is that paradoxically, I find myself looking forward to experience setbacks. This is because they give me a chance to develop my skills in dealing with these setbacks. And in particular, I found that I perked up a bit in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't happy that it happened. But when it did happen, I felt like a fireman who had practiced putting out fires for years without having a real fire to put out. And now I was in the midst of a real fire. Another curious side effect of using the Stoic test strategy is that I get a bit nervous when things are going too well in my life. I get this sneaking suspicion that the Stoic gods are softening me up ahead of a significant test, that they are, to use an agricultural metaphor here, that they're fattening me for the kill. This has resulted in a very much toned down level of celebration when my life is going well. A third curious consequence is that I catch myself talking out loud to imaginary Stoic gods. Sometimes I compliment them for their ingenuity in the way they're testing me. And sometimes I engage in a bit of low-grade trash talking when I quickly and efficiently pass one of their tests. Okay, I need to pause here to emphasize that the Stoic gods of which I speak don't really exist. They're purely imaginary. So why use them? Because it's a wonderfully effective psychological device. By thinking in these terms, I can, on being set back, keep my frustration and anger to a minimum. Doing this, I might add, makes it easier for me to find a clever workaround to the setback. It's hard to think if you're angry and frustrated. Some will argue that a truly rational person would refuse to invoke imaginary beings in this manner. I would argue that a truly rational person will recognize that we humans are intrinsically irrational as a result of the neural wiring we acquired in our evolutionary past. And being truly rational, this person would be perfectly willing to use a psychological tool that would let him minimize the negative impact that this wiring would have on his life. A case can be made then that believing in imaginary Stoic gods and even talking to them isn't a sign of insanity and isn't even a sign of irrationality. Now, having said that, I should add that if the Stoic gods talk back to you, that's a different matter altogether. Another consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's let me work on my ability to find and exploit silver linings. And let me explain. When something bad happens, most people don't even try to look for silver linings. They feel too deflated to do so. And to make things worse, they're convinced that there aren't any silver linings to find. A Stoic, by way of contrast, will instinctively look for silver linings to unfortunate events. They are almost sure to be there, but it might take a bit of time and energy to uncover them. Because it disrupted and even destroyed so many lives, the COVID-19 pandemic is a very dark cloud, but it nevertheless has several silver linings. Some of these linings occur at a personal level. Item, for lots of people, the pandemic meant less time commuting and more time spent with family. This in turn might have triggered a much needed rethinking of priorities. And that's a silver lining, if ever there was one. Item, by forcing us out of our usual routine, the pandemic gave us an incentive to discover new ways to spend our time. I, for one, rediscovered cycling. Item, by taking things from us, the pandemic revealed to us how many things in our life we are taking for granted, including, for example, going to baseball games, hugging elderly relatives, or going to lectures like this one in person. When life gets back to normal, as perhaps it someday will, we don't know yet, we're going to savor these activities. Just imagine what it'll be like to go to your first baseball game with a crowd of people around you. There were also silver linings at the economic level. Yes, lots of people lost their job or were forced to close their businesses. But while this was going on, there was a headline-inducing upsurge in new business applications. For many savvy individuals, the pandemic represented a golden opportunity that they had been waiting for a long time. New demands were being created, and they were going to make a business out of satisfying those demands. Now, so we're running along on time here a bit, so let me wrap it up. I want to thank you all for hearing me out tonight, and I also want to thank the Stoic gods for not presenting us with a Stoic test during this lecture. These gods, I've discovered, are quite tech savvy. They have the ability, for example, to cause my computer to seize up just as I'm coming up on a deadline. And they could easily have brought tonight's proceedings to a halt, but chose not to. So far, we'll see. And being a college professor, I'd like to leave you all with a homework assignment. If this lecture was your first exposure to Stoicism, I encourage you to give Stoicism a test drive by trying out some of the techniques I've described. You might find that the fit between you and Stoicism is quite comfortable. And you might even find that you're what I call a congenital Stoic, that you've been using in a low-grade way Stoic techniques all your life without understanding their history or the psychology behind them. And if you showed up for this lecture already a practicing Stoic, my assignment is to listen to some podcasts, do some further reading, and develop your practice. Stoicism is a very deep well from which you can draw wisdom that will help you flourish in this, the one life that you have to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I guess people can applaud in their various ways for very stimulating, relevant, interesting talk. I'll allow participants to unmute themselves. There's quite a bit going on in the chat. One of the things that was interesting in the chat was that as you were talking about negative visualization and that sort of thing, people started thinking of things that we've lost here in Alfred, like local Japanese restaurant has ended, and a local pizza place has folded as well, and so that that kind of struck home the what you're saying about things taking things for granted until they're gone. There was let me question from Danny Gagné. Danny, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question about reconciling downward comparisons?
Sure. Hi. So as I was listening to you, it occurred to me that it is very psychological in nature, and this idea of making comparisons between where you are and perhaps someone else is a downward comparison, or what we would call that. And so, how would you reconcile making downward comparisons as a means of appreciation with this idea that discontent breeds change? And so, the way we alter our unhappy circumstances are through change. But yet, if we are practicing this acceptance and practicing this appreciation, would that necessarily then stymie societal change if we all kind of practice this?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in the Stoics, you find this interesting counterbalance between number one, really savoring the life you find yourself living, and number two, doing things. They turned out to be very, as human beings, they really were achievers. So, for instance, Seneca, who is currently my favorite Stoic. Let's see. So what was he? He was a Stoic. He was also a counselor to an emperor, chief counselor to an emperor. He was also a playwright, and he was also the first century AD equivalent of a billionaire because of his many business undertakings. You look at Seneca, you look at Marcus Aurelius. Oh, he was emperor, and he was working on a number of changes. So it's a weird thing. The Stoics thought that they had a social responsibility to their fellow human beings, not just a kind of a go around and turn everybody into a Stoic, but realize that people who aren't living the lives of Stoics are enduring a fair amount of self-inflicted misery. And so you take sympathy on them, you attempt to help them. So a Stoic, and this would be true in general, so you get this other paradox, and that is, if you're a Stoic and you're doing things to help other people, it's interesting because you can find yourself prospering, and yet at the same time, you have trouble thinking of anything worth spending that money on because it isn't the kind of thing that you're most interested in achieving. You're more interested in experiences. You're more interested in relationships. And by the way, even if you do are very aggressive, and even if you do work very hard and are very ambitious, it could be a very miserable life you're having. I certainly know people who keep thinking, there's only one more thing, one more level, and if I can only get there, I'll live happily ever after. And sometimes if a conversation comes around to that, I like to say, you're chasing mirages. You'll get there, and then you'll just see it vanishes. It wasn't there. And you'll see another one off in the desert, and you'll chase that one as well. But there is that kind of tension. So you want to be ambitious. You want to be ambitious in the right way. And while you're being ambitious, you want to thank your lucky stars that you have the life that you have.
Bill, there's two comments in the chat from Alexi. If Alexi wants to unmute themselves, they can. The one of them has to do with negative visualization. So many emotions, bitterness, jealousy, despair, are derived from comparisons to the prospect of better circumstances in a hypothetical future or the better days of the past. The value of the moment seemingly diminishes with the knowledge that there may be things I might never experience for the first time, much less the last, or that certain things will never be regained. And so I suppose the thrust of that is that in practicing negative visualization and related techniques, there's a implicit perhaps comparison with what's going on now with what could be or what was. And isn't there a danger that that will undermine the idea of living in the present? I think that if Alexi wants to elaborate on it, she can unmute herself, or he or they can unmute themselves. Otherwise.
Yeah, do we have a person who wants to?
Yes, sir. So
Okay. Hey.
unfortunately, I'm going to have to speak a little quietly. I'm currently hiding out in the library here at Alfred
Okay.
University. I suppose my question with that is, we're, in a sense, we're a fluid identity throughout our lifetimes. And in response to more experiences and just the maturation process, I think we change and our outlooks change. And so I wonder if perhaps only focusing on the present and the moment, I think that kind of cuts out a significant part of our reality and our experiences as a person. And once again, that goes back to that point of considering our past and our future. So I think Professor Westacott, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, kind of hit the nail on the head. Is there not that risk of kind of limiting our perspective with this philosophy?
Okay. In response, first of all, it's impossible to stay in the moment. And I don't know if you've ever tried Zazen meditation, but it's just remarkable how active your mind is. And it's remarkable how many of the ideas that float into your head, because they're in your head, you take ownership of them. They're in your head. They must be what you want. They must be your ideas. So the danger of living in the moment, it would be like the danger of holding your breath until until you die. You're not going to do that. You're going to break out of that. But it is nice from time to time to realize, okay, you've got all this activity and your days are so busy, and just to sit back and take a moment and really just imbibe that moment and savor that moment, and realize that there will come a time in your life later on when there's a very good chance you'll wish you could get back to that very moment. But right now you're living it. So enjoy it. And then back to planning, back to thinking about the past, thinking about what you have to do. So the Stoics, again, come across as very ambitious individuals. Anybody who started School of Philosophy back then had to have had a degree of ambition. The Stoics also tended to get themselves in trouble and were often exiled, and yet managed to survive the exiles, not just to survive them, but to thrive despite being exiled, because they had this ability to take what they had and do the most they could with it. So I don't have any tattoos, personal revelation here. I don't have any tattoos, but if I did, I would get one that said, and this is a motto that Stoics should have used, no one did, and it seems to trace back to a particular individual in the early 20th century. But it's a bit of advice. Do what you can with what you've got where you are. And I think that's a profound truth, that if you go through life doing what you can with what you've got where you are, you're going to be probably have the fullest life that you can. If instead you are always passing off and saying, somebody else make it all better for me, I got a complaint, I've got an issue, probably you're going to be an unhappy individual. Yeah, so think about the past, learn from it. Think about the future, plan for it. And part of the plan is the realization that you're going to experience setbacks. So part of your plan is to prepare yourself for those setbacks. And the Stoics were very, very good at that. So we didn't talk about it tonight, but in the Stoic Challenge, I talk about Stoic training, where you go out of your way to do things that are going to make you physically and emotionally uncomfortable, just so you can toughen up for the setbacks that life is sure to present you with if you live long enough.
Bill, there's a question from Kathleen. Kathleen, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll read out what you wrote on the chat. How did you know that you wanted to become a philosopher? And did something within Stoicism stick out to you during your college experience? I suppose a lot of students are here listening to this talk and going through their college experience and certainly experiencing setbacks. And it's kind of interesting thought whether when you kind of came to Stoicism fairly late on, whether it sort of related to anything in your previous experiences?
I became a philosopher because, and it's a longer story. I'm going to give you the short version of it. So I was in high school, senior year in high school, 1969, 1970. During that year, two important things happened. I read Henry David Thoreau's book, Walden, and I watched a documentary about the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. And those sort of pushed me off on a path. I went to college and actually did not start out a philosopher. I wanted to be a physicist. It turned out physics is really hard. But you know, had a side interest in philosophy. And like I tried to explain, I wanted to follow Henry David Thoreau's footsteps, you know, and come up with a philosophy of life, and found out you couldn't do that. But I also knew that if I managed to get a job in philosophy, I would have freedom to think about things I wanted to think about. And I like teaching, so I could do that as well. My discovery, I wasn't really, other than their logic, I wasn't really exposed to the Stoics in college. But when I turned 50-ish, I had a low-grade midlife crisis. And as part of that, I decided I was going to become a Zen Buddhist. So the book On Desire is actually written for mixed motives. Number one, I needed publication so I could go up for further promotions. Number two, it would give me a chance, I thought, to explore Zen Buddhism, which is kind of what I thought I was going to become. But in the process of exploring it, I stumbled across Stoicism, which is a rival philosophy of life. And I found that Stoicism had the same kind of ultimate goal, you know, this avoidance of negative emotions, as Zen Buddhism did, but it had a much lower price of admission. So if you want to become a Zen Buddhist, you're going to do a lot of meditation, and you might have your moment of enlightenment tomorrow, or in 30 years. Could go either way, and you can't know ahead of time. I'm not putting down Zen Buddhists, okay? If you're one of them, I've been told by a very reliable source that you can easily be both a Stoic and a Zen Buddhist. But for me, the fit with Zen Buddhism was just wonderful. Because I would call myself a congenital Stoic. I've been kind of practicing it all my life, but not really kind of knowing what the psychology and history behind it. So the fit was real nice. So by the time I finished writing On Desire, goodbye to Zen Buddhism and on to Stoicism, and just has worked really well for me. I don't know if it works really well for everyone. There are people who seem to be simply anxious individuals, but there are other people who, once they try it, it's like, wow, this is easy to understand. It's not metaphysical, and it has a very dramatic impact, or can have, on your life. And my sales pitch for this is, on a 3-day weekend, that's enough time for you to, number one, figure out what Stoicism is about, and number two, figure out whether it's going to make a positive difference in your life or not.
It's also time about right for reading your book.
Yeah, great way to do it.
Kathleen has a follow-up question. Kathleen, why don't you just unmute yourself and ask that question?
Okay, you kind of already answered it, but like, as a student who's like thinking about minoring in philosophy, what advice would you give me?
What's your major going to be?
I'm majoring in English right now.
Okay. So I ended up with a double major. So I told you my interest in physics. So I was doing both physics and math and then physics got really hard. So I abandoned physics in favor of philosophy. And then I had a choice. I could either become a philosophy major or a double major in math and philosophy. There were any number of people who told me it's really, really hard to find jobs in philosophy. So I thought, and by the way, that if you had a major in philosophy, there would be employers that would hold it against you because they would think you would sit around all day saying, is this hand a human hand, right? Which is, you know, parody. But I figured what I would do is get a double major and try to get a job in philosophy. And I could always hide behind the math major, right? If plans went astray. And it turned out that I attribute it to luck, because there were a lot of very talented people who went to graduate school with me who didn't end up in tenure track positions. So English, though, is I don't know, you can get jobs in English. I know that. It's probably a better thing than philosophy, job-wise, although I don't have specific numbers. But philosophy as a minor, it's just a wonderful way you can explore ethics. You can explore the meaning of life. You can explore, at least at your university, you can explore philosophies of life. So, when you graduate from college, there's going to be two big things that happen. There's going to be your job, which is going to take up about 1/4 of your remaining years as a human being. If you factor in, I did the math on this once, factor in your retirement and everything else. Oh, and the other 3/4 is going to be life itself. And you want that to be good life. And there seem to be a lot of people out there who aren't having particularly happy lives. So it'd be a great thing to explore.
Bill, Beth Ann Doby has asked, would we do well to go back to teaching students to examine, to lead the good life in contemporary philosophy programs? And another person, Diane Debrell, Bill's niece, has made a contribution in the chat about how this in some ways could be useful to her as she works as a 5th grade teacher in difficult circumstances under the pandemic. And just linking those two things together, I wondered if you thought that both, in response to Beth Ann's question, should we be teaching more philosophy of life in universities? But what about the idea of teaching philosophy of life in schools?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't know the level at which philosophy can be first meaningfully taught. There are all sorts of things you can do, though. You can teach certainly critical reasoning skills from the earliest days. A lot of teachers discourage students who ask why questions, but that's how you learn. You can teach people. Besides teaching them moral values, you can teach them about how you can think your way toward moral values. You can teach them how to reason their way through moral dilemmas. So there's all sorts of things you can do. I think from earliest days, I certainly know with my own kids, I tried to introduce them in a low grade way to philosophy. But I don't know the earliest age at which you can do a lot of the more technical kinds of philosophy. The sort of Stoic techniques, I think my parents were kind of using them on me early on, Think about the poor kids and think about what you've got that they don't have. And you're lucky to be here. I mean, a lot of adults certainly told me things like that. So I was getting a kind of an informal instruction in Stoicism just in the process of growing up.
Okay. Early on, Gary Ostrower asked this question. If the Stoics were not emotional icebergs, why have we gotten this subject so wrong? Why have so many of us misunderstood the Stoics?
I don't know, just a public ignorance. The Epicureans were not Epicureans. It just the Cynics were not Cynics. So we've taken these words, and then just kind of without a full understanding of what the people who practice these various philosophies, what they actually thought. Instead, we just simplified it in our own minds. What's a Stoic? Well, he just stands there and grimly takes whatever life has to throw at him, and that's the end of it. No, and then you start reading about the actual Stoics, and they had lives, and they had parties, and they had friends, and they had, and they were cheerful individuals, which is a paradox. But the way people think, we like to have simple answers to complex questions. I teach a lot of critical thinking, And I often tell my students that many of the questions you have, there's two safe answers. First is it depends, meaning it depends on how you're using the words you're using, right? And second safe answer is it's complicated. Whenever you're discussing some major issue in life and people want a quick, easy answer, you know, in a political sense, they want a 2-word slogan, right? Or a 4-word slogan. You can take your pick, except that's just not how life works. So if you think your way through, then you're going to arrive at complex answers. The other thing about critical reasoning, and when I teach it, I try to teach my students that it's perfectly acceptable to say, I don't know. I need to give it more thought. And I know as an academic, if you answer that to somebody, they're always shocked. No, you're supposed to know everything. And they say, no, I don't. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's really complicated, and I'm still working very hard to get it figured out. Can you come back to me in a year or two and re-ask that question, and then I'll be ready to answer. And maybe I will, maybe I won't. But that's the approach.
Do other people have any questions? People are free to unmute themselves if they want. Just from the chat, Bill, you might be amused at this. My colleague Gary Ostrauer, who you spoke with earlier, he and I play golf regularly. And I try to help him practice his Stoicism by beating him as often as I can. And the other day for his birthday, I was able to give him a golf ball on which was inscribed the motto, "Desire is the root of all suffering."
Yes. Yeah. Now, and if you get his mind off his game, it can either ruin his game or improve his game. I guess in golf, it can go either way. Yeah, I've never played golf. I've heard dangerous things about it, that it can lead to certain kinds of obsessions. But
it's a good walk spoiled, is what they call it.
Yeah. I do believe, as part of Stoic training, in first of all, in doing physical training, where it's, you know, both uncomfortable and emotional, and competitions too. So competitions are fun because you learn that what matters, you know, like they say, it isn't whether you win or lose that matters. And in sports, it's okay. Did I do the best I could with what I had? And if you did, good for you. Well, did you medal or not? Doesn't matter. That's not the game I'm playing. The game I'm playing is this internal game. It's a game against myself. And I describe I think in Stoic Challenge, I describe the individual I call Lazy Bill. He lives inside me, and he is so lazy. He spends his time in a back bedroom of my mind playing video games, as far as I can tell. And whenever I'm doing something hard, he comes out and says, can't you just take it easy? Can't you just relax? So so I wrestle him to the ground and pummel him into silence by going ahead and doing the thing that needs to be done.
Well, last orders for anyone with any questions for Professor Irvin.
This is Andrew Kluss from History. So just really quickly, so you've talked about Stoicism. I can see the appeal. What about the failed ancient philosophical schools? So what just totally flopped as a life philosophy?
There are a whole bunch. I mean, what's interesting, and in the book on desire, and which I wrote so long ago, and my memory is starting to slip that I can't name them all, but I described several of the schools that did come up, and it's I was astounded. You know, it's like everybody who has a dream and says, I want to start my own business. Oh, I know, I'll do a school of philosophy. I've lately become aware that now in America, there are a whole bunch of schools aimed at self-improvement, different lines of thought, and people are actually willing to pay interesting amounts of money to do this. And who can start one? Anybody. Anybody at all can start one. And what you do is you come up with an idea of, I will improve your life in some respect. You've got to give me money. I will give you lessons of some kind. The ancient world was full of that. And some of those people have made a difference, and we're still talking about them, but most of them, you know, it's probably, and this is just me making up numbers here, but it's probably like, what, of the schools, maybe 2 or 3% we are still around and still affecting us. The rest, they flopped.
And of course, we the ones that flopped, we tend to have less texts and records.
Yeah, and you know, the Greeks, most of their texts disappeared, but fortunately the Romans had them and then put their own spin on it. So there are other things that can happen. That is the loss of, you know, the writings of a group. And sometimes, you know, with the Buddhists, it's interesting. You know, the original writings, right? Well, you know, there were people who wrote afterwards, and that's also true in the Bible. So it'd be nice if people who came up with something would simply write it down in detail for the rest of us, but it often doesn't work out that way.
Okay, anyone else want to unmute themselves to ask a question? In that case, I would like to thank Professor Irvin again for a very stimulating talk, and something that we can both take away, think about, and certainly apply in our everyday life. So thank you, Bill.
Oh, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank all of you for hearing me out. And one last assignment, go have some chocolate, because you never know,
Thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I do have to say that is an assignment I could get behind.
It's a funny process, Bill, this, where at the end of a talk, everyone suddenly everything shrinks. I've been teaching a lot of Zoom classes, and usually at the end of each class, there's 1 or 2 squares left.
Yeah.
Presumably they aren't there.
Yeah, now here's another thing to think about, because I've certainly seen this. When we were talking before we opened, you know, the people who are there can hear,
yes,
can watch, which is fine, but I've certainly been in situations where the hosts didn't realize